Hello everyone, my name is DeltLead, and today we're breaking down which of the many mobile space simulator games that are out there are truly the best one. Now, I'm going to be comparing each of the games based on their gameplay, their realism, graphics, and their price, and I'll give you my opinion on which game I think reigns supreme. Now, before we get into this, I think it's important that we define what a space simulator game is. Now, if you went to Google Play and just typed in space, you'd see all sorts of games, from MMOs to tycoon games to shooters and even real-time strategy games. But none of these types of games are what I'm talking about in this video. I'm specifically looking at mobile games that allow you to build and design rockets and launch payloads to space, explore a solar system, and do all those sorts of things. Of all the space games that are on the Google Play Store, there were 5 that I felt truly met the criteria for this category: Space Flight Simulator, Space Agency, Simple Rockets 2, and Space Simulator. These are all pretty fun mobile games, and I want to make it clear in advance that I'm a fan of all of them. So if you're a diehard fan of any one of these games and I criticize your favorite mobile game ever, don't freak out and tell me that I'm wrong in the comments, because I've played all these games quite a bit and I really am a huge fan of them and their creators and what they stand for. Now, for the comparison, like I said before, I'm going to be ranking each game on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest, for several different categories, and then I'm going to take the average of the scores in each category for that game to determine the average score for that game, and then compare the games side by side to determine which mobile space game is the absolute best. For these categories, I'm using gameplay, what the player can do, and how engaging the primary game mechanics are. I'm looking at realism, how true to real-life physics the games attempt to be. Cost, what the developers charge for their base game and any expansions, add-ons, DLC, or in-app purchases. And the visuals, how good the game looks overall, how appealing it is to play. Now, before I get into the actual breakdown, if you'd like to see more videos like this one where I break down different games or do comparisons between different space games, then please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support is what makes it possible for me to make these kind of videos, and I really appreciate all the positive feedback I've gotten so far. Now, without further ado, let's get into our first mobile space simulator, largely considered the king of mobile space simulators and by far the most popular one, Space Flight Simulator. Space Flight Simulator is a 2D rocket game with a realistic physics engine that allows the player to build rockets from a set amount of parts and explore a miniaturized 2D solar system. It was released in November of 2017, making it 4 years old as of the recording of this video. Spaceflight Simulator is free to download on the App Store and Google Play, and with over 10 million downloads, it's a very popular game. I love Spaceflight Simulator. It's a solid game, it runs great on just about any mobile device you can find it on, and with a free-to-play version, it's very accessible to the market. You can pay for part expansions, which add new parts like fuel tanks, rocket components, and these enhance and change the gameplay significantly, and there's really only so much you can do with the free version of the game. The gameplay, especially if you're just using the free version, is somewhat limited. It's pretty much just a sandbox game, and unless you buy the part expansions, it's really not even that big of a sandbox. You've got a very short list of parts to work with. But one of the big things that it adds is the ability for users to create custom systems. But for the rest of the view, I'm not going to be talking about any custom systems or user-created content. I'm just going to be focusing on the base game and the part expansions that are provided by the creators. Overall, for gameplay, I give Spaceflight Simulator a 6 out of 10. The sandbox nature of it is fun, but it doesn't have challenges or missions that you can do, let alone a career mode or any more fully fleshed out campaign. As far as how realistic the physics simulation is in SFS, it's not too bad. Orbital mechanics are modeled properly, and they used Apache Conics modeling, which is pretty standard for space games in this genre. Atmospheric drag modeling is very inaccurate, however, with drag mostly being ignored until you reach orbital velocities, and this is only a recent feature with the most recent update. Overall, I give SFS an 8 out of 10 for physics. It's really good, but the atmospheric modeling could be improved to get it up to a 10 out of 10. Looking at cost now, to buy the full game with all expansions costs $7.49 USD, which is a pretty steep price for a mobile game. But you can pick and choose what part expansion packs you want, and if that's too much for you, you can always play just the base game. The $7.49 price point actually makes the full version of SFS the most expensive space game available in this list, which is somewhat ironic given how popular it is as a free mobile game. I give SFS a 7 out of 10 for cost. It's a free base game, which is why it's as high as it is, but I just can't justify giving it a 10 out of 10 with so much content locked behind such a high paywall. Now, from a visual standpoint, Spaceflight Simulator is, well, a little underwhelming. One thing I really like about it is the recent 1.53 update, which added re-entry effects, and these are honestly gorgeous and fairly realistic for a game like this. But to the rest of the game, the graphics are about what you would expect for a mobile game. One thing that SFS and really any other 2D space game will never be able to fully capture is just the magnitude of scale of a space. In a 3D space game like Simple Rockets 2 or Kerbal Space Program, you can turn your camera and you can look at the planets that you're orbiting. You can watch them grow smaller and smaller as you fly away from them and leave their sphere of influence. In Spaceflight Simulator, you can zoom out and pinch your screen with your fingers, and you can maybe just see the surface below your craft, and only right before landing or takeoff. And then after that, you're just looking at your craft in a black kind of generic star background for the whole game. And you can really only see the planets in the map view, and they've only rendered the planets as single solid color circles. So overall, I give SFS a 6 out of 10 on the visuals. It's okay, but it just can't compete with 3D games, and it's pretty simplistic in its graphics. Now, taking the average of all of the categories, Spaceflight Simulator comes in at 6.75 out of 10 overall, a solid score for a solid mobile space game. Next up is Simple Rockets, and no, not Simple Rockets 2, the mainstay of my YouTube channel, but the OG mobile space simulator by Jundrew. Simple Rockets was released on September of 2013, over 8 years ago, as of recording this video. Simple Rockets is probably the first space simulator of this genre to make it to mobile devices. And Simple Rockets, like SFS, is a 2D rocket building game where you can design and launch rockets and explore a miniaturized solar system. All the celestial bodies in Simple Rockets are the same as our home system, except they have an SM in front of them, presumably meaning small or simple, like Smurth, Smeenus, and Smoopiter. Now, these silly names betray how in-depth the game is, since most space simulator games released since the Simple Rockets game owe, at least in part, their inspiration to Simple Rockets and to Jundrew. Now, gameplay in Simple Rockets is very limited. There are only a few parts you can use for rockets, even fewer than SFS, and there are no part expansions you can buy to get more. If building rockets in Spaceflight Simulator is like playing with Legos where you click the blocks together and then launch it and it's really easy, then building rockets in Simple Rockets is like playing with Lego Duplo. They're even simpler, even more child-friendly blocks to play with. Now, one thing that Simple Rockets does have that SFS does not is tutorials and challenges, which give the player quantitative goals to strive for. But beyond these challenges, there isn't much more to the game. For gameplay, I give Simple Rockets a 7 out of 10 overall. For realism, Simple Rockets checks all the same boxes as Spaceflight Simulator. It models orbital mechanics the same way, and atmospheric drag is modeled maybe slightly better in Simple Rockets, but there are no re-entry effects in the game, no heat damage, so I have to take points away there. I give Simple Rockets a 6 out of 10 for realism. Unlike SFS, there is no free version for Simple Rockets. Coming in at $2.99 USD on the App Store and Google Play, it's relatively affordable, but there's no content beyond that purchase. You get the whole game up front. Now, you can buy skins in the game for an additional 99 cents, but they have no impact on gameplay, so I'm not really factoring them in the cost since it's totally an aesthetic in-app purchase. Overall, I give Simple Rockets 5 out of 10 for cost. It would be higher because it's relatively cheap, but there isn't enough gameplay to really make it worth any more than that. The game is past its expiration point, and the devs have moved on to bigger and better projects, so they're not updating it anymore. It's kind of a relic of the past. Now, for the visuals, Simple Rockets 2 is old, and it looks like it too. It has the same issues as Spaceflight Simulator when it comes to the limitations of 2D space games, but to add on to that, there are no pretty re-entry effects like SFS, and the graphics are older and a lower resolution. The exhaust of rockets looks cheesy, and it's all just kind of lackluster all around. I give Simple Rockets only a 3 out of 10 for visuals. Now, I loved Simple Rockets, and I played it a ton in high school when it came out, but after Simple Rockets 2 was released, I switched over to that, and I've not really looked back since. I play it maybe once in a while just for the nostalgia purposes, but not much beyond that. Overall, Simple Rockets gets a 5.25 out of 10, which is not bad considering how old the game is, but it's definitely fallen to the wayside over the years. Next up, we have a game that breaks away from the strict realism of physics-space games and instead focuses more on being simple and fun. Space Agency is a 2D rocket game where you can build and launch rockets, with the goal just being to build space stations, launch satellites, and explore the solar system. Space Agency was actually just released right before Simple Rockets was in June of 2013, making it also 8 years old. Now, Space Agency is all about building things, and the orbit and gameplay is focused entirely on that. You can launch pre-built station modules and build them in space on historic rockets like the Soyuz, the Mercury, and the Saturn V, and even the Goliath Soviet N-1 rocket. Building rockets is very simple, and the game even shows you how much lifting power your rocket will have as you're building it. It's definitely set up for a lower common denominator of player base. Now, there is a career and a sandbox mode, with the career mode being a series of increasingly difficult missions that you must accomplish while being under a budget. Space Agency is very fun, and it's a simple game that you can do a ton with, so I give Space Agency a 10 out of 10 for gameplay. It sets out to be fun, easy, simple rocket game, and it achieves all of those goals with flying colors. Now, it might get a 10 out of 10 for gameplay, but it comes at the cost of realism. Space Agency doesn't even attempt to model orbital mechanics or patch conics. Aside from some very basic collision physics, there isn't even an attempt to be realistic, so I give Space Agency a 2 out of 10 for realism. It's not trying to be a realistic space simulator, it's just trying to be a fun, rocket building and flying game that's available to anybody. Now, while Space Agency might be unrealistic, it is free to play. Now, there are some in-app purchases that allow you to skip missions, which I really don't care for, but I'm not going to count those specifically against the game. However, there are in-app purchases in Space Agency that I really do not like. They charge about 99 cents for the player to buy a demo for a mission, and you have to buy one demo for each of the 37 missions if you want all the demos. Honestly, I think that's a stupid idea to include in a game and even have as an option in the first place, let alone to charge a player $1 per mission. I give Space Agency a 6 out of 10, and it would be higher if they just got rid of that feature alone and let it be a free-to-play game, but that in-app purchase really annoys me, and I think it would be better if they just left it out. Space Agency does have some decent visual effects, though. While it's a 2D game, it doesn't suffer from the same issue that SFS and Simple Rockets does, of not being able to see the planets you're orbiting. Now, it does this by totally ignoring scale in the game, and making the planet small enough that you can easily see the entire planet on the screen without even having to zoom out all the way. In any other space game, this sort of disregard for scale would be a bigger issue, but it keeps with the style and the goal of Space Agency, not to be a super realistic game, but to be a fun, free mobile game. Overall, I give Space Agency a 7 out of 10 for their visuals. That places Space Agency with an average score of 6.25. It's still a good score, but it truly isn't a space simulator game, it's more of just a free mobile game. Next up, we have a game that is barely even considered a game, but puts all of its chips on being the simulator. Space Simulator is a rocket simulation software that lets you simulate various historic and even current rocket missions in a full-scale 3D solar system. Unlike all the other games we've talked about so far, you don't build any rockets in this game at all. You simply select a scenario you want to run, then an automated launch program accurately simulates that mission in real time on your mobile device. You can interact with the simulation, move the camera around, and watch the rocket as it flies. You can even switch over to manual and try to fly it yourself, but the whole game is on rails and there's not a whole lot of control you can exert. I also don't really like the UI at all. There's very little explanation on how to use the controls, there aren't any helpful tutorials, and all of the menus and controls are very clunky and not user-friendly. There's no designing, there's no exploring, there's no building, just a finite list of simulated missions that you can run. For these reasons, I'm giving Space Simulator a 1 out of 10 for gameplay, just because it's not really a game, it's a simulator. As far as realism goes, on the other hand, Space Simulator is the most accurate mobile physics simulator I've found as of yet. True to its name, it really does simulate a rocket from launch to orbital insertion, so I give Space Simulator 10 out of 10 in the realism department. Now, as to the cost, Space Simulator isn't free, and at $4.99 USD, it's far from a cheap mobile game. If it were more fleshed out, it had better UI, and it was more enjoyable as a game than as a pure simulator, then maybe I would give it a higher score and the price would make more sense, but as it stands now, it's just not worth the price. So I give Space Simulator 3 out of 10 for cost. And lastly, just looking at the visuals, yes, it is 3D, and yes, it does look cooler than a 2D game, but the graphics are honestly kind of garbage. Very low resolution textures, very little attempt to make the game look good, so overall I gave it a 5 out of 10. Mostly just because, even though it has 3D graphics, they look like they're from the early 2000s. Overall, Space Simulator gets a 4.75. Not a great score, but Space Simulator is a very niche mobile title with a very niche objective. Last up, we have what I contend is the best space game out there right now. It was released in September of 2019 by Junru and is the sequel to the 2013 Simple Rockets mobile game. Simple Rockets 2 is actually a PC game that the company ported over to mobile after the initial release. While the mobile version of Simple Rockets 2 has always lagged behind the PC version somewhat, the team at Junru has done a lot of good work keeping the versions current within at least a few weeks of each other, and this game is actively in development by their team now. Simple Rockets 2 is currently purely a sandbox game, though like the original Simple Rockets, there are a number of challenges in the game that players can achieve and set high scores on. Rocket building in Simple Rockets 2 is far more customizable than any other game we've talked about so far. With every part in the game being procedural, you can adjust the size and the shape of your fuel tanks, your engines, your fairings, your motors, and with a long list of different types of parts available to you, there's almost nothing you can't build in Simple Rockets 2. The sandbox is immersive, with a massive system of over 20 celestial bodies to explore. They have a career mode in the works that may look similar even to the career mode of Kerbal Space Program. But right now, the game is completely focused on being a sandbox. Overall, I give Simple Rockets 2 an 8.5 out of 10 for gameplay. I would give it a 10 out of 10 if and when they release the campaign mode for the game sometime next year, but until then, it's going to sit at an 8.5 for its excellent sandbox. Simple Rockets 2 does pretty well in the realism department, not nearly as well as Space Simulator, but better than pretty much any of the other titles we've talked about. The ability to model orbital mechanics in 3 dimensions absolutely gives SR2 a leg up over its other mobile competitors. The atmospheric physics is pretty good, but there are some wonky exploits that are pretty unrealistic on the more extreme end of crafts, so I give SR2 an 8 out of 10 for realism. Now, Simple Rockets 2, like its predecessor, is not a free game, and coming in at $7.99 to buy the game on Google Play or the App Store, it's the most expensive game on this list, with Spaceflight Simulator coming in at second at $7.49 for the full game. I give Simple Rockets 2 a 5 out of 10 for the cost, which is a higher score than some of the cheaper games I've talked about, but because of how much Simple Rockets 2 has in the content and gameplay department, it justifies that higher price. Remember, Simple Rockets 2 is a PC game on Steam, and it goes for $14.99 there, making the mobile cost a lot more reasonable when you think about it that way. And lastly, the visuals. Simple Rockets 2 has absolutely gorgeous visuals, especially when you're in orbit and that sun rises over the horizon. I mean, the game boasts real-time shadows and reflections, and a host of other visual enhancements that make it stunning. Now, sadly, on most mobile platforms, these enhanced visuals are completely out of reach, as they're just too taxing on your average phone's GPU. Still, even at a reduced quality, Simple Rockets 2 is a stunning game. The two things that I do not like about how Simple Rockets 2 looks overall is the exhaust plumes on the rockets and re-entry effects. The exhaust plumes are somewhat unrealistic, and at lower resolutions they just kind of look cheesy. And the re-entry effects are actually really disappointing. They opted to just make your craft glow orange during re-entry instead of actually creating that re-entry smoke trail and the billowing fireball of gases coming off your heat shield. Overall, I give Simple Rockets 2 an 8.5 out of 10. If they upgraded their re-entry effects and made the exhaust plumes look more realistic, then it would be a 10 out of 10, but it really just falls short of the mark there. Overall, I give Simple Rockets 2 a 7.5, with its weakest category by far being the cost, which is high enough to be prohibitive to some players even to buy it. Otherwise, I think it's a smash hit for mobile space simulators, and it's personally my favorite. So let's see how all these games rank side by side, and which is the best in each category, and which is the best overall. Here I've put all the scores of each game in a table so we can compare pretty easily each game side by side. From this table, it's pretty clear how our games stack up. In 5th place, we have Space Simulator. In 4th place, we have the original Simple Rockets. In third place, we have Space Agency. In second place, we have Space Flight Simulator. And in first place, we have, in my opinion, the king of mobile space games, Simple Rockets 2. Now, if you're a die-hard Spaceflight Simulator fan, then don't unsubscribe now, because I love all of these games, and Spaceflight Simulator truly is a great game in its own right, but it honestly just can't compete against Simple Rockets 2 any more than it could compete with Kerbal Space Program. They're not the same genre, they're not built for the same platform. Comparing Spaceflight Simulator to Simple Rockets 2 or Kerbal Space Program is like comparing the world's fastest go-kart to a relatively cheap Honda Civic. They're just not on the same playing field. So don't get too offended if you think that Spaceflight Simulator should have been number 1. I know just how popular that game is, and I know how big that community is, so please don't be throwing any hate. This is just from my opinion based on these rankings and how I value the different attributes of these games. Now, if you'd like me to play any of these other games that I mentioned in this video, please comment below your favorite. I'll be doing some more Spaceflight Simulator content here in the next few days, so keep an eye out for those videos when they come out. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, then please consider subscribing to the channel. I really appreciate the support, and by subscribing, you're telling me that you like my content and you want to see more. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next video.